Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. I hope you had a wonderful Thanksgiving weekend. We certainly did around here as well. And now, of course, the Christmas season begins. And so in the first half hour here, I wanted to spend a little bit of time kind of getting us in that mood. And then we'll get back into some of the issues in the news. And second hour, we'll have another interview as well. But if you are familiar at all with the Christmas story, or perhaps have a nativity scene in your home, you know that we always have Mary and Joseph and the baby Jesus and the shepherds and the wise men. Of course, if you've listened to this program any length of time, you know that in our Christmas quiz, we really kind of challenge whether or not there were actually three wise men, because it tells us there were three gifts, but maybe those weren't all the individuals who were there. We've raised some questions about when they arrived, because it says they arrived in a house rather than the manger, so it's quite possible that this was much later. And so there are all sorts of things that have grown up around the story of the three wise men, even have been given names, and there's been embellishments, I think, of the story. But does that mean that there isn't a true story? Well, I think that there is, and that's why we're going to, I think, enjoy this conversation about a new book. I was able to get a page proof of it as it came out, The Mystery of the Magi, The Quest to Identify the Three Wise Men. It is published by Regnery History, and the author is Dwight Longenecker, who is a pastor, award-winning blogger, and freelance writer, a graduate of Oxford University, written 16 different books on different aspects of religion. And we have a link to his website and information about this book, which I think you're going to find fascinating. So, Dwight, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
You know, one of the things you say, especially in the little video that I watched as well, is when we see like a story about King Arthur, we recognize there's been an enormous amount of embellishment and all sorts of different ways in which people have taken on the legend of King Arthur, but there probably was a true historical King Arthur. In some respects, you say this is the same thing, because in the Gospel of Matthew, we have just some straight phrases that then, of course, over the years, especially during the Middle Ages, have been embellished. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't a true visit from these three men who might have been Nabateans. We'll get into that in just a minute. But explain a little bit more about why you wrote this book.
Well, I'm a fan of J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of Lord of the Rings. And in one of the stories of Lord of the Rings, one of his characters says, history became legend and legend became myth. And this is really what's happened with the story of the wise men. Matthew, I'm pleased to say, records the very simple history in his gospel, but over the centuries, and not just the Middle Ages, but as early as the 3rd century, the story began to be elaborated and exaggerated for some very interesting reasons that I can't go into now, but are in the book. And those elaborations continued right down to the present day, where people are still writing fictional accounts of the wise men and, you know, children's musicals and so forth. A bit like the King Arthur story, there was a real King Arthur, but he's not very connected to the musical Camelot or a Monty Python film or Disney's Sword in the Stone.
So it is a little bit different. And again, I love your little quote there about history becomes legend, legend becomes myth. And so in some respects, we've had the skeptics for many years saying that, well, we have the Jesus of history and then we have the Christ of faith. Or in this case, we have the story of maybe there was something about Jesus. Maybe there were even some people that visited, but later it got to be embellished into three string kings of Orient are, and we have all sorts of songs we sing and all the rest. And yet what you came back to is saying, if you take a little bit different look and just take Matthew at what he writes, and then we understand that circumstances of the ancient Near East this story actually rings true and doesn't look like an embellishment or some kind of myth that Matthew just simply added to try to extend the kingly idea of a birth of a future king.
That's right. A lot of the modernist scholars have heard the elaborate, embellished version, which was highly magical also and full of these mystical wizards who came from a far east. And they rightly sort of shrugged their shoulders and turned up their nose and said, yeah, probably not. That sounds like a fairy tale. And in fact, in that sense, they were right. The embellished version was highly improbable. But when you go back to Matthew's gospel, and then, which is what I did, and then began to do the research of the history, the politics, the economics, the religion, the culture of the time, I was just amazed. It was astonishing how all the pieces of the puzzle just fell into place.
Well, and again, let's talk about Matthew for just a minute, a Jew who also most likely had to have written before, of course, the 70 A.D., the collapse and the destruction of Jerusalem, probably even before the persecution of Nero in A.D. 64, whatever that might be. You have a tradition that is pretty strong of those individuals that say that Matthew did write this gospel. So we have essentially an individual who was an eyewitness of Jesus, who also was collecting these oral histories that had actually taken place, since he was not there when Jesus was born, that puts them in an order and isn't really trying to embellish. If anything, is just trying to record what historical facts he was able to glean from the people that were eyewitnesses at the time. Fair?
Yes, and scholarship is coming around more and more to understand the ancient tradition that Matthew's gospel was written, first of all, in Hebrew and Aramaic before the Greek version, which we now have. And that very early collection of stories and about Jesus and sayings of Jesus in Hebrew or Aramaic may have been composed as early as the mid 40s. So really only about 10 years after Jesus' death and resurrection. So those stories are very early, and the Magi story is actually one that's only found in Matthew's gospel. So we might actually conclude and say that therefore makes it one of the earliest ones. Also, Matthew's writing to the Jewish Christians in Judea around the area of Jerusalem. So they would have remembered this visit to Jerusalem just a few years before. Remember, Matthew's gospel says all of Jerusalem was in an uproar when these Magi visited. So it would have been a memorable event.
And again, I think that helps answer some of the other questions, why later people say, well, why didn't Luke talk about it in Luke or in the book of Acts, or why didn't Paul talk about it? And I think you have some good answers there. So I want to take a break, and when we come back, we've already caused a lot of people to pick up their nativity scenes and throw them on the floor, because I've already changed some views here. But let's do one more, and that is, we've always heard that the Magi, since they were from the East, that must be Persia. You're going to help us understand that if we look at another place, what are called the Nabateans, we've talked about them before on this program, but it's been at least a year or two. We want to get into what Matthew might have meant by saying that these individuals came from the East and where they came from. Then we have a little bit of an understanding of why they would give these three gifts, these three categories of gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, that have a significance in that culture. And then also, of course, they were saying that they saw some star, or it could be a planet, and how that may have been influential as well. So we have some really important things to set forth. And if this is something that you would like to know more about, again, we have a link to Dwight Longecker's website, and you can find that. We have information about this book on our website. Probably will be able to find it in your local bookstore as well. It's published by Regnery History. We'll come back and talk about the mystery of the Magi right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The tax bill making its way through Congress may be a slight improvement over the existing tax code, but just barely. Columnist George Will reminds us that the best solution would be to repeal and replace the tax code. There is a bill in Congress that would actually do that, but it won't ever get an up or down vote.
The Tax Code Termination Act would delete the 4 million word code as of December 31st, 2021, and require that Congress replace it with a new one by July 4th of that year. George Will says that it could just as easily be called the Mitch Daniels Act. Daniels was the head of Office of Management and Budget who wished the tax code looked as though it had been designed on purpose. One statement by George Will in his column got my attention. He says that 62% of American households pay more in payroll taxes than in income taxes. He also added that 45% of American households pay no income tax. That's when I decided to dig into the numbers provided by the Tax Policy Center. Nearly 36% pay more in payroll taxes than income taxes, and an additional 26% pay no income taxes but do pay payroll taxes for a total of 62%, cited by George Will. When you add the 18% who pay neither income taxes nor payroll taxes to the 26% who pay payroll taxes but no income taxes, you get the total of 45% of American households who pay no income tax. The tax reform bill would double the standard deduction to $12,000 for individuals and $24,000 for married couples. This change will increase the number of people who will not have to pay any income taxes. That will make it even harder to get tax simplification because fewer Americans will be affected by the tax code. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue your conversation today on the book Mystery of the Magi, The Quest to Identify the Three Wise Men. Dwight Longenecker is with us. And again, let's, if we can, Dwight, for just a few minutes, talk about the misconception that we have so often that the wise men or the Magi, they were stargazers or astrologers. They came from Persia. But we're going to use a couple of words we don't use too often around here. One is Zoroastrianism or Zoroaster and the Nabateans. But once you understand what you begin to argue in chapters 4 and 5, you begin to have a lot of pieces fall into place, don't they?
They really do. And it's natural that they would have concluded that the Magi came from Persia for some interesting reasons. You mentioned earlier the date of 70 A.D. That's when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem and the Jews were scattered. The Jewish Christians were also scattered, and the center of Christianity moved from Jerusalem north, obviously to Asia Minor, Syria, and then to Greece and Rome. Now, when you're in Asia Minor, Greece, and Rome, and you read in Matthew's Gospel that the wise men came from the east, well, the east from there is Persia, present-day Iraq and Iran. But Matthew wrote his gospel to the Judeans that were around Jerusalem, and if you go east from Jerusalem, you get to the country of Nabatea, which is in northwest Arabia, the present-day Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And the other reason they concluded was because the word Magi comes from Magoi, which is actually a Persian word, and there was actually a very ancient caste of wizards and wise men and shaman in Persia who were called the Magi. And so it was an easy mistake to make, but like I say in the book, with mystery stories, very often the obvious answer is not the right answer. And so we dug a little bit further and found the answer that I believe is the correct one.
Well, and again, when we talk about the Nabateans, we're also talking about Petra. And I know that when your daughter was there one time, she saw that not only does a lot of people know where Petra is, they remember from Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, and she saw a number of teenagers dressed as Indiana Jones, complete with leather jackets, felt hats, pistols, and bullwhips. So how does Petra and Jordan and Saudi Arabia fit into this particular story that we're talking about in terms of the Magi?
Well, one of the first clues that I had was I went back to the Old Testament and said, what if the prophecies about the Magi in Isaiah actually indicated where they came from? And Isaiah says that the kings shall come from Saba and Sheba and Ephah. And these are the names of Arabian tribes from his time period around the 6th or 7th century BC. And so I said, well, who was there when Jesus was born? And it was the Nabateans. The Nabateans were a very influential trading country. They controlled the trade routes from Yemen up across the Saudi Arabian Peninsula and then west to Gaza, where they loaded their goods onto ships to be distributed around the Roman Empire. They also controlled the routes from Egypt up north to Syria and then on to Babylon. And Petra in Jordan was the crossroads of those two trade routes, and so it was their capital.
So again, that gives you some of the connection. Now, make the connection then between Herod the Great and now the situation that you have with the Magi, because they, of course, come to first meet with Herod, and you argue, and I think convincingly, that they were looking for maybe even, if you will, an alliance or an ability to build some relationships between the Nabateans and Herod and those individuals that were in and around Jerusalem.
This was one of the most fascinating things about the research, that when I dug into the political background, I found that Herod the Great, who's, of course, mentioned in Matthew's Gospel as being the king of the Jews at the time of Jesus' birth, his mother was a Nabatean princess.
Mm-hmm.
He was brought up as a boy in the court of Nabatea, and the Nabateans were therefore his direct neighbors to the east. And he had relations with them. He fought a war against them, and they had troubles all through his reign. But right at the time of our Lord's birth, around 5 or 6 BC, the Nabateans had every reason to groom a good relationship with Herod the Great. They needed to go across his territory to get their goods to Gaza, is one thing. But also, he was in the good books with Caesar Augustus, the emperor, and the king of the Nabateans, Aretas IV, was not. And so Aretas would have had every motivation to say to some of the wise men in his court, why don't you go and pay a diplomatic visit to our neighbor, King Herod? They would have seen signs in the night sky indicating a newborn king of the Jews, and I believe they went believing that Herod had a grandson or a great-grandson who would inherit the throne, and they went to pay tribute to that newborn king of the Jews. And when they got there, Herod said, what grandson? And him being notoriously paranoid, well, we know the rest of the story.
Sure. Well, and again, let's talk about the gifts that they bring, because, of course, we all see that people have tried to spiritualize it. Gold stands for the king and frankincense for worship and myrrh for the death. But if you go back and look at that time, if you had a gift of, or wanted to give multiple gifts of tribute or a gift of tribute, oftentimes the very gifts that they would give, the Arabians would give, were what? Gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So this begins to parallel your argument as well, doesn't it?
Yes, it's amazing. I began to do the research and find that it was very typical in the ancient Near East for, as it is today, for kings to pay a diplomatic visit and to bring diplomatic gifts. The president does that. Presently, when he goes to visit a foreign country, he will present gifts which are typical of the United States to the foreign head of state. And so the gifts that were typical of Arabia were actually gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Why? Arabia was famous down in the ancient times for its gold. They had gold mines in Arabia and in East Africa that they controlled. But also, frankincense and myrrh are both taken from the sap from bushes that only grow in the Arabian Peninsula. And so, therefore, the gold, frankincense, and myrrh actually indicates where the kings came from. where the Magi came from. They came from Arabia, and these were representative gifts of their country.
So let's, if we can, just talk about some of the resources people can find. First of all, we have a link to the book. I would imagine people can find it in their local bookstore. We do have a link there if they wanted to get it, both in paperback as well as in Kindle, or hardcover, I should say. And then also we have a link to your website. So talk about what's available there. It's DwightLongenecker.com. You don't have to spell it all out because we've got a link there. But you're a blogger and an author, and certainly if people wanted to get this book from you or to find out a little bit more about some of the other things you're writing about, what will they find when they land on your webpage?
Well, they'll find my comment on my blog on different spiritual matters, on Bible study, on church matters and current events. But also, I'm blogging a fair bit on the subject of the Magi at the moment, as the book is coming out now about around Christmas. And they can also get in touch with me if they want to invite me to speak to their church about the historicity of the New Testament. This is why the book's important. It's not just a Christmas book. It's actually saying, look, the New Testament, as we have it, the Gospels, are essentially reliable historical accounts. Given the fact that they were written 2,000 years ago, they actually do connect us with the life and times of Jesus, the Roman Empire during the time of Caesar Augustus, and so forth. And so one of the things I do when I go around and talk to schools and parishes and churches is compile not just the Magi story, but other evidence that's come up in recent years, which help to support the historical reliability of the scriptures. And I think this is very important because so many people in our society, they kind of think that the New Testament gospel stories are a mishmash of fairy tales and fables. So this book is important to say, no, actually, it's rooted in history.
One of the things we talk about at Point of View is not only do we want you to be able to articulate a biblical worldview, but also know how to defend it. That second point is known as apologetics. And this book is really a good apologetic, if you will, for this whole idea of the reliability of the New Testament, and also maybe shattering maybe a few of your myths and feelings about that. You've had some people say, well, I like the old story better. Well, that's fine. You can still, sing we three kings of Orient are and all the rest. But the reality is, if you want to understand the story as explained in the Gospel of Matthew, I think that Dwight has done a very good job of that. So thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Again, the website is one that I would point you to. You can, of course, find the book in your bookstore, but again, you can go to DwightLongenecker.com, find some of that material there as well. Longenecker is Longenecker, but again, we have a very easy link for you to follow. And I thought just as we get into the Christmas season, be fun to talk about a book that not only begins to help us understand some of the story behind what Matthew records in his gospel, but also gives, I think, one more very adequate defense of biblical reliability. So if you would like that book, it is available. And if you'd like to know a little bit more about him, we have a link to his website as well. We come back, we have a lot to cover. As a matter of fact, looks like we might have tax reform. What's that going to mean to you and your family? We'll talk about that right after this.
Black Friday, Cyber Monday, there's no end to the ways people are enticing you to spend money. But in the spirit of giving, a reminder that tomorrow is Giving Tuesday. The idea is that amidst the rush to consume, we'll also remember to invest in things that matter. And for Point of View, in line with 2-for-1 specials and BOGO, buy one, get one, we invite you to step up and duet. D-O-E-T. What is that? Donate 1 equals 2. You donate $1 to Point of View Radio, and through a special deal with one of our friends, your dollar becomes 2, your $20 becomes 40, your 50 becomes 100, your 1,000 becomes 2,000. So just duet. Donate 1, which equals 2. And our doors are open now. Click the banner at pointofview.net. Or call 1-800-347-5151. Or mail your donation before the clock strikes 12 Tuesday night. Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Pointofview.net. Just do it. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Just a minute, we're going to get to the issue of tax reform, but I thought I might just mention real quickly, as we have already mentioned in one of our spots, that tomorrow is Giving Tuesday. Now, you got to laugh about over the years all the different names. You know, Friday is Black Friday, and then, of course, Black Friday started, it seems like, last week on Tuesday. You know how that goes. Today is Cyber Monday, and then tomorrow is called Giving Tuesday. Now, again, that is something that has been artificially created, but I think it is a good idea for this reason. Sometimes people wait to the very last moment to give to ministries, to churches, to Christian radio stations, to even a group like Point of View, to the very last. And I am going to use the fact that on many of the very important ministries that I support, that tomorrow is a very good time, starting even today, because as we just mentioned a minute ago, your gift today will be doubled. And so I believe the last time I heard, we have about $9,000 that's been put forward by some generous donors who recognize the importance of giving. And the reason I suggest this is it's a good time right now when there's some focus. This year, I don't know if you realize, but I believe Christmas is on Monday. And so that means that only Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, really just 4 days for giving, and those last 2 days when people normally start thinking about giving, which would be the 30th and the 31st, that's over the weekend. Of course, we won't be on the air unless you hear a broadcast of that. A lot of churches might benefit from that, but this, I think, is going to even require us to think more ahead of time rather than get those last-minute emails or announcements on the air about giving before the year end. And so I hope you'll consider what you might do to support this ministry if you believe in what we are doing, and certainly appreciate everything that we'll talk about today, from the mystery of the Magi. We're going to have Doug Groothuis with us in the second hour today, walking through Twilight, and in just a minute talking about the tax reform bill, and I might get into a couple of other issues. One of the articles we posted today is on sex scandals today, so I'll get to that a little bit later. But if you appreciate these kinds of conversations we have every single day, this would be an excellent time for you, starting today and through tomorrow, to give and to have your gift doubled. So a gift of $50 becomes $100, a gift of $100 becomes $200. And I don't know about you, but I always appreciate ministries that have taken the time to organize that and to maybe even contact some of their donors ahead of time so that I see my gift doubled, and I hope that you will consider doing that the same. Let's, if we can, get into the issue of tax reform. Let's again put this in perspective. As I announced last week, the House of Representatives passed tax reform by a vote of 227 to 205. That puts it in the United States Senate. Now, there's still some debate about who will or will not vote for this, but it's, I think, important to, first of all, talk about what's in these various tax reform bills. They will be different. The House bill and the Senate bill are different. Many people think the Senate bill is preferable. We'll see what happens when it comes out. And in just a minute, because of our good friends at the Daily Signal, they actually took 7 taxpayers' bills, if you will, and tried to figure out what that would cost them. In other words, let's look at what they would have to pay the Internal Revenue Service based upon these tax reform bills as they are currently held. So I'm going to go through that in just a minute. But let's again recognize that this, in both the House and the Senate, are fairly similar in these regards. That is, that they would actually double the standard deduction to $12,000 for an individual, $24,000 for a married person. We have a little bit of difference in that you have the child tax credit. I think it's $1,600 in the House, $2,000 in the Senate, so a little bit different there. Both of them would have a reduction in the corporate tax rate from 35% to 20%. And most importantly, it just simplifies it some. Not a lot. If you've seen my commentary, which is out today, the best tax reform would be to start all over again. George Will wrote a piece a while back about repeal and replace the tax code. It won't happen, but it's a great if you will, thought experiment in my commentary today on the Viewpoints commentary, you can see. But nevertheless, this would at least reduce the tax brackets from 7 brackets to 4 brackets. It would repeal the state and local tax deduction. And I think that has been a way in which sometimes the red states have been actually subsidizing the blue states. So we'll see how that plays itself out. It also has a better treatment of business income and investments, lowers the overseas profit rate so that we would bring lots of money back. There are some estimates of anywhere from $2 trillion to $3 trillion that's overseas, owned by American companies, but they won't bring it back, have not brought it back because of the high tax rate. This would, in a sense, be an immediate infusion in capital into this country, and that would be significant. And then one of the other elements that's been discussed and might be implemented, at least in the Senate bill, and could be maintained in the House, would be the repeal of the individual mandate. And the value of that is simply that then the money that oftentimes has to be provided to individuals in order to help them meet their financial needs in terms of the insurance wouldn't necessarily have to be used. And so that would be a little bit of a reduction in the benefits and also make it more possible that this would not affect the economy in such significant ways. So there are all sorts of very considered issues, but let's, if we can, for just a minute, before I take our next break, look at what Rachel Gressler has put together at the Daily Signal, looking at 7 hypothetical tax bills for individuals. The first one she talks about is hypothetically a Tom Wong, a single teacher with a median earning of $50,000. So he's a teacher, he's a homeowner, and he's also a business owner. He would save $900 in round numbers with the House bill, $1,100 with the Senate bill. So the benefit to a single person would be immediate in terms of some of the benefits there. Let's look at those with a family. The example she uses there is the Jones family, a married couple with 3 children. They're homeowners, and their combined income, his and her, is $70,000. He's a sales representative. She's a part-time nurse. They're homeowners. And again, and I mentioned just a minute ago, he was not, I said business owner. Tom Wong was not a business owner. I misread that. So he's just a homeowner, and the Jones family is just a homeowner. They're not business owners. Again, the benefit to the Jones family with 3 children, homeowners, $75,000 in annual income, would be a savings of $1,000 with the House bill, $2,000 with the Senate bill. There are a couple that are a little higher on the end. Let's take one where we've got some individuals that are business owners. How would that affect somebody as a business owner? So they use the Fernandez family, married couple with 2 children, owners of JM Blinds and Shades, and they're also homeowners. So they're small business owners. They own their own home, and they're business owners as well. And the actual cost to the Fernandez family in the House bill would be a minus about $800. They would actually lose ground in terms of the House bill. In the Senate bill, they would gain ground significantly, about $9,000. So those are just a few examples. There's 7. I didn't want to run through all of those, but it gives you a little bit of a range from a single individual who is a teacher who would make about $900 to $1,100 more and not have to pay so much in taxes. The Jones family, annual income about $75,000. He's a sales rep. She's a part-time nurse. They're homeowners. They would get a benefit of reduced taxes of $1,000 in the House, $2,000 in the Senate. And then, of course, I used the one with a business owner, which would have an annual income of $250,000, would actually, because of that business and some other things, and because of the tax jump, would actually have to pay more in taxes with the House bill, would get a benefit in the Senate bill. So we'll see how that plays itself out. But if nothing else, I wanted you to see that there are real consequences to this debate about tax reform. And when we come back, let me also talk just briefly about what is on my commentary, because if nothing else, it's a reminder once again that we have a tax code where a large percentage of the American citizens do not pay taxes. it is really kind of striking that George Will even talked about the fact that 62% of American households pay more in payroll taxes than they do in income taxes, and about 45% of American households pay no income tax at all. That percentage, by the way, will go up. I can sort of quickly analyze from both the House and the Senate bill. So if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Also have some things to say about the sex scandals, which have been significant and certainly are having an impact in not only Congress, but may have an impact in the upcoming primaries and general election. But if you'd like to join us, let's take some calls first. 1-800-351-1212. Your comments about tax reform and any other issue on the table, we'll take those calls right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Most residents of Lehigh County, Pennsylvania probably have no idea what their county seal looks like. It has a cow, factories, a silo, an oil lamp set on 2 books, a courthouse, flags and bunting, and more. Recently, a federal district court reluctantly declared the seal unconstitutional because, centered in the background of it all, is a cross. According to the court's opinion, quote, the county has not legally compelled its citizens to practice and conform to Christianity, infringed on freedom of conscience, or created political conflict between the Christian church and other religious sects. Simply put, the county of Lehigh did not intend to establish religion or institute a county religion, unquote. And so the court concluded, quote, Lehigh County's seal is a passive symbol that does not coerce any citizen to practice or adhere to Christianity and does not establish a county religion. Thus, the seal does not violate the plain text of the Establishment Clause, nor does it establish a religion in the way the drafters of the First Amendment imagined. Higher courts, however, have delineated a different mechanism by which the court must determine whether the seal survives constitutional scrutiny. While the court may not fully agree with the test provided, the court must apply that test, unquote. Well, we can only hope an appeal will change that test. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Students and teachers are being told that prayer, Bibles, and religion are illegal in public school, but that's not true. Learn the facts. Read your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit for students and teachers at firstliberty.org right now. Don't let anyone steal your freedom with bad information. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit for students and teachers at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Let's take some phone calls. We'll go to South Carolina first. WAGP. And Bruce, thank you for calling today here on Point of View.
Thank you for taking my call. I wanted to address a question that I have about both of these bills. Do they retain the charitable contribution deduction for those of us who give.
Yes.
I have not heard anyone speak to that.
Well, and the reason they have not is because very few of the deductions have changed. To answer your question, yes, those are retained, and anything that you give, if you itemize, will still be listed as a deduction, and so you'll be able to take it off of your Schedule A, and so that would certainly be the case. And the only major deductions which have been even debated, and that's why you've heard others talk about that, has to do with the deduction for state and local tax deductions on income and sales tax. But even the one that they talked about whether or not to have for adoption credits, those were retained, and so all of these are still pretty much retained. The real big debate, of course, has been on the repeal of the state and local tax deduction, which may or may not be in the final bill. But charitable giving, that's still going to be there, and that's why you haven't heard anything about it, because there was no change in that whatsoever.
All right, I appreciate that. Now, the 7 examples you gave earlier, you gave about 3 of them. Do they have any examples that cover people that do charitable contributions and what the savings would be?
Yeah, the assumption here is that some of these are giving charitably, and I went through those really quickly, but let me go through them a little closer, because I didn't want to take too much time going through all 7. I kind of gave you 3 or 4 just to give you a representative. But one of the things I might do is post this article for maybe tomorrow, the Daily Signal, and you can read it in the details, because what it does is it takes you through all sorts of individual circumstances. But I tried to pick kind of one of each category, one with a single teacher, which I mentioned just a minute ago. And this would be an individual that may or may not itemize his deductions, but because he's a teacher, makes about $50,000, he would benefit. The Jones family's a little different, because in there it does talk about the fact that they receive larger tax credits. It looks as if they are indeed giving some donations. So in this particular case, the Jones family, they actually have savings of $1,000 in the House bill, $2,000 in the Senate bill. And then I just jumped ahead past, they've got one called the Smith family, but they're making an annual income of $1.5 million. That doesn't relate to most of us in the audience, so I just skipped that one in the interest of time and went to the Fernandez family, because this was a couple that, again, has a business. So that is both homeowners and a business. And so they are involved in manufacturing and various things. They have blinds and shades, and they're then finding that they have certain parts of the tax system that are not indexed for inflation. Again, the implication is they probably made some charitable deductions, and so they actually lose money. They would pay more in taxes in the House bill and then gain in the Senate bill. So I just tried to pick out a couple of examples, but I'll try to post that, or you can just go to dailysignal.com and see if one of the 7 taxpayer bill examples they give kind of correlates with where you are. And, of course, everything changes from person to person. Most of you in the listening audience, if you're like me, you give a lot more in charitable giving than the average American. And so I have found before that if you believe in the tithe, for example, you're off the charts, because most individuals, in terms of charitable giving, even people that call themselves born-again Christians, tend not to give a tithe. George Barna found that less than 10% give 10% of born-again Christians. So if you tend to be an individual that gives to nonprofit organizations, to your church, to Christian organizations, to groups like Point of View, you're going to have a whole different set of circumstances than these typical scenarios that are put forward on what that might look like for your family. So you'll have to do the calculations yourself. But I just might mention that my commentary today is on the tax code. And the reason I did this is because George Will, a while back, suggested that really the best way to deal with the tax code would be repeal and replace. Now, we've heard repeal and replace of Obamacare, but he's talking about repeal and replace of the tax code. And there actually is a piece of legislation in Congress that has been introduced. It's not even going to get an up or down vote, but it's worth mentioning just as a thought experiment. It's called the Tax Code Termination Act. It would actually delete the 4 million word code as of December 31st, 2021, and would require Congress to replace it with a new one by July 4th of that year. And he said that maybe we should call it the Mitch Daniels Act, because Mitch Daniels, who interestingly enough served as the Office of Management and Budget, that's all the way back in the Reagan administration, said he wished we had a tax code that looked as though it was designed on purpose. Because you can see that this tax code does not look like it was designed on purpose. If anything, it's a tax code that looks like it was put together by committee, and that's exactly what was happening, and that's why we have such a mess in terms of the tax code. Let me just mention, too, one of the articles I've posted here from the stream, Sex Scandals, No Witch Hunt. I might add to that some material that I'll have as a commentary coming out as well, in which you're starting to have more and more people saying, well, you know, it's just the society we live in, or it's really society that's the problem. Or you have this kind of virtue signaling right now where if you check a lot of social media, you're seeing a number of men posting comments in order to repent on behalf of all men, as if all men are guilty of all this. I love Charlie Rose the other day. He said, all of us, including me, are coming to a newer and deeper recognition of the pain caused by conduct in the past and have a profound respect for women in their lives. And I love that. All of us, you know, all of us weren't engaged in the behavior that got you fired by CBS and PBS. So please don't pin your behavior on the rest of us. If there's an answer to this, it's the biblical answer. Number one, to recognize human sinfulness and hold people accountable for their sins, and to ask those individuals, some in Congress right now, to step down and to leave in disgrace. But more importantly, to recognize the importance of rules. You know, ever since the sexual revolution, we've had everybody throwing out all the moral rules about sexual behavior. And as a result, words like virtue and propriety and chastity and chivalry, those were all thrown out the window. And maybe it's time to come back and recognize there is some value in having rules. There's value in having various kinds of social moral standards. And instead, we have a society that basically says you can do anything you want with anybody else as long as it's consensual. But what does that mean, given the fact that almost every kind of behavior seems to be allowed in a culture that it's turned its back on biblical morality? So again, just a couple of issues that we may get to later in the week. But before we take a break, let me just mention that, again, we have Giving Tuesday. Even today, you can have your gift doubled. And so if you appreciate what we talk about here on Point of View, we would certainly appreciate your gift. And you can go to our website, pointofview.net, click on that button, and then we have some suggested amounts, or you can put in an amount of your choice. And that means that your gift will be doubled up to $9,000. So we are excited about the fact that your gift of $100 becomes $200. Maybe there's somebody there that could give $250. That becomes $500. And that would really help us to end in the black and with our financial house in order. So we're really excited about the possibility that tomorrow, Giving Tuesday, we hope that you will not only support this ministry, but support your local church, support the local Christian radio station if they raise funds, and support those ministries that are certainly vital for us to continue to articulate a biblical worldview and bring the gospel to the world. Let's take a break. When we come back, Doug Groothuis with us, Walking Through the Twilight, A Wife's Illness, A Philosopher's Lament. We'll talk with him right after this.
Black Friday, Cyber Monday, there's no end to the ways people are enticing you to spend money. But in the spirit of giving, a reminder that tomorrow is Giving Tuesday. The idea is that amidst the rush to consume, we'll also remember to invest in things that matter. And for Point of View, in line with 2-for-1 specials and BOGO, buy one, get one, we invite you to step up and duet. D-O-E-T. What is that? Donate one equals two. You donate $1 to Point of View Radio, and through a special deal with one of our friends, your dollar becomes $2, your $20 becomes $40, your $50 becomes $100, your $1,000 becomes $2,000. So just duet. Donate one, which equals two. And our doors are open now. Click the banner at pointofview.net. Or call 1-800-347-5151. Or mail your donation before the clock strikes 12 Tuesday night. Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Pointofview.net. Just do it.
Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour we're going to be talking about what happens when people you love and the circumstances you find yourself in begin to fall apart. An individual that maybe has difficulty using a phone, tying your shoes, just going about the day-to-day activities. Having lost parents both through Alzheimer's and cancer, having my extended family dealing with everything from depression to dementia. I have a little bit of an understanding of what we're going to be talking about this hour, but I wanted to give you a chance to hear from an individual that we've depended on so many times over the years. Doug Groothuis is the author of books that back in the 1980s educated us about the New Age movement, books like Unmasking the New Age and Confronting the New Age and Revealing the New Age Jesus. He's been on the program with us talking about apologetics, one of the focuses that we have in this program with his book, Christian Apologetics, a comprehensive case for Christian faith, and so many other books that I could mention. An individual that received his Ph.D. from the University of Oregon, but also had a master's degree in philosophy from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Individual that has been a member of the Evangelical Theological Society, the Evangelical Philosophical Society, and many other groups. But we're going to talk about a difficult book because it is the story of his wife, Becky. And we want to help you understand how significant it is. Such incredible reviews from people like Oz Guinness and Eric Metaxas and Lee Strobel and J.P. Moreland, people that have been on this program before. This book is out. It is published by InterVarsity Press. It's entitled Walking Through Twilight, A Wife's Illness, A Philosopher's Lament. Forward by Nicholas Wolterstorff, and Doug Groothuis. Dr. Doug Groothuis joins us now by phone. Doug, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby. It's really good to be with you again. I was thinking our first interview was was with Marlon Maddox back in the day, probably 86.
I was going to say, it goes back 30 years, I think, so
yeah.
There we go. And we have called upon you so often. Now, some of us that have followed you on Facebook have heard a little story, and some of the story about your wife's illness. But I guess we need to really start with that, because some people mistakenly think that as she goes through dementia, it's like what my father went through with Alzheimer's, but it's just the opposite, isn't it? Explain if you might.
Yeah, and I'm very sorry about all the illnesses in your family, Kerby. I'll try to keep that in prayer. When people think dementia, they think of Alzheimer's disease. And Becky does not have that. She has something called primary progressive aphasia, which is a rare form of dementia. It's a frontal temporal lobe disorder. So the decay starts from the front of the brain and moves backward. Alzheimer's is the other way around.
Right.
Now, the result is the same, which is the brain will not be able to support the body, and the person dies. But the first signs of this are difficulty finding words and difficulty in accomplishing tasks. And Becky and I went to see a neurologist for a solid year. That was 2013. And he said she doesn't have Alzheimer's. I think she has depression mimicking dementia. But she didn't. She was admitted into behavioral health in February of 2014 for depression. And then through some treatments and diagnoses, she was given this sentence of primary progressive aphasia. When I was told about it, I said to the psychiatrist, "What is that?" Had no idea what it was.
And I think it illustrates that, first of all, we're going to have some lessons I want to pass on to everyone, because everybody's, if you will, pilgrimage is different. But one of the lessons is you may not necessarily get the right diagnosis for a while. And early on in your book, you talk about the fact that he said, "Oh, no, she doesn't have Alzheimer's." Well, that's right, but it wasn't very helpful either.
Yeah.
Doesn't have dementia, all those kinds of things. And so the misdiagnosis, later on I want to talk about some of the other things you share about referring to a person in a second person like they're not human or not in presence, and all sorts of others.
Yeah.
But I mentioned Facebook. You mentioned that late in the book, but I'll come up to that. A lot of people say, "I don't like Facebook because, I want to know what people are drinking in Starbucks or something like that." But it has been helpful, because I know that if I were to run into you, I wouldn't ask the question everybody else asks. "How's Becky doing?" After a while, you just get tired of answering that question. You already know I've been thinking about you, praying for you. People know your circumstances, and there is a sense in which I've felt like I've gone a little bit on the journey with you by following you on Facebook, even before I had the privilege of reading this book cover to cover.
Well, Facebook has at least two sides. It can be quite trivial, but it can be profound and can help build relationships and solicit prayer. I know that there are people literally all over the world who pray for me. And I have a chapter on that called Lamenting Online.
Yes.
And I've chosen to publicly lament, and I've certainly made mistakes, but I've had many people say that this has helped them in their own journey through darkness. And I've gotten tremendous support. I mentioned in the book that I met someone through Facebook who is an editor, and she's edited some of my shorter writings. Becky stopped editing my work 2010.
Mm-hmm.
That was even before she was diagnosed. But the last book that Becky edited was Christian Apologetics, which is really my magnum opus, so I'm happy about that. But this friend who edits some of my work edits a lot like Becky did. So it's quite a gift, and that came through Facebook.
One of the things about Becky, because she was a wordsmith, both of you are, and that's one of the things that drew you two together. So it is hard to see somebody struggling in front of a dresser trying to explain that I want shorts, and not being able to even come up with the word, and you're trying to figure out what she's trying to say. A woman who had such facility with the language, as do you, not being able to use the very thing that she was probably best noted for.
Yes, it's nothing less than tragic, and it's something that we have to face every day. I should say, Kerby, that before the program, I went upstairs and I told Becky and her caregiver that I'd be on the radio for an hour. And I told Becky I'll be on with Kerby Anderson. We work with him in Probe, and she smiled. She remembered you.
That's amazing. Because, there comes a point with my father, which is the opposite. He never stopped talking, but he didn't make much sense. And at the end, I was just this nice man from Texas. I wasn't his son. But that's, we all go through that. I want to take a break. But when I come back, I want to talk about the title, because you call this Walking Through Twilight, and you chose twilight rather than darkness. And I want to get into that. And then also just talk about your own experience, your emotions, and see if we can pass on some lessons to our listeners. And if you're joining us today, let me first of all mention that this book is out. It's published by InterVarsity Press, and we have a link to Doug Groothuis' website if you would like to find out a little bit more about that. And you don't have to know how to spell his name. It's a little difficult, but we have that available. We also have a link to the book in case you can't find it in your bookstore. It is available both in paperback and Kindle. But I hope you will go to a bookstore and buy it if indeed it is available there, because you will find it very helpful as you try to minister to those walking through the twilight. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The tax bill making its way through Congress may be a slight improvement over the existing tax code, but just barely. Columnist George Will reminds us that the best solution would be to repeal and replace the tax code. There is a bill in Congress that would actually do that, but it won't ever get an up or down vote. The Tax Code Termination Act would delete the 4 million word code as of December 31st, 2021, and require that Congress replace it with a new one by July 4th of that year. George Will says that it could just as easily be called the Mitch Daniels Act. Daniels was the head of Office of Management and Budget who wished the tax code looked as though it had been designed on purpose. One statement by George Will in his column got my attention. He says that 62% of American households pay more in payroll taxes than in income taxes. He also added that 45% of American households pay no income tax. That's when I decided to dig into the numbers provided by the Tax Policy Center. Nearly 36% pay more in payroll taxes than income taxes, and an additional 26% pay no income taxes but do pay payroll taxes for a total of 62%, cited by George Will. When you add the 18% who pay neither income taxes nor payroll taxes to the 26% who pay payroll taxes but no income taxes, you get the total of 45% of American households who pay no income tax. The tax reform bill would double the standard deduction to $12,000 for individuals and $24,000 for married couples. This change will increase the number of people who will not have to pay any income taxes. That will make it even harder to get tax simplification because fewer Americans will be affected by the tax code. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. Douglas Groothuis. And again, he is the author of this book, Walking Through Twilight, A Wife's Illness, A Philosopher's Lament, and talking about his wife, Becky, who edited all his books except this one and the earlier one, Philosophy in 7 Sentences, going all the way back to that first book, and that is Unmasking the New Age. And so if that name is familiar, you perhaps have many of his books on your shelf. Let me come back to the issue of the title. You talk about early on in the book that you called it Walking Through Twilight and chose the word twilight instead of darkness. Can you share that with us?
Yes, at first I thought about entitling the book something like Entering Darkness, but I realized that it was more like the twilight before the darkness, and that's because at the time I wrote it, and still now, Becky is living at home. We can converse. It's mostly me talking and her listening, but she can understand some things and nod or laugh. She still has a very good sense of humor, although more things are getting past her at this point. And I don't really think I will write about the next stages in terms of probably having to go into assisted living and losing more and more capacities. It seemed like God was leading me to write about this stage of things in the hope that could minister to caregivers.
I remember you saying you did not want to write it, but it wanted to be written. And in some respects, in just a few minutes, I want to open up the phones because I suspect others have been through this either experientially or vicariously, and certainly have some things to offer. One of the other aspects of your book which surprised me was Sonny, the dog. How significant the dog was, and that is something I guess we shouldn't be surprised about because we have service dogs and have caregiving dogs and all the rest. but it does seem to me that animals can be used in a way to help those that are losing some of their functions, and they can be, as you said, a substitute for God's grace just about as well as any one of us that walk on two legs.
Well, that's true. And some years ago, 5 years ago, a friend of ours thought that a dog would be good for us, and we said, well, we really don't have it in us to train a puppy because Becky at that time was still quite sick and so on. And this person said, I'll train the dog for you, and then after he's trained, you can have him. So that happened in 2012. And Sonny is a golden doodle. He's very loving, fun-loving. Honestly, not the smartest dog on the block, probably, but he has tremendous emotional intelligence.
Yes.
So I have a few references to how he has comforted us and performed for us. He's very sensitive to Becky's moods. In fact, she can just begin to get upset. She's not even crying, and Sonny will come over and nuzzle her and lick her. So I have a chapter even called Dogs, Dementia, and Us, where I reflect on
very good
a biblical view of dogs, which is not very high, largely because they tended to be dirty, mangy kind of straggler dogs, or roaming dogs, I should say. But they are gifts from God, especially as they have been domesticated and the breeds have been developed. So we look for light wherever we can find it, and we find a lot of light in our golden doodle.
Very, very good. Well, we focus some on Becky. Let's focus on you, because one of the more striking chapters, and again, I just love what some people have said. Osgin has said, would I write as Doug Groothuis does here? Could I even begin to? I was humbled by his memoir. Others talk about it being poignant or profound or just, again, vulnerable. You share early on just anger, and I don't think of you as being an angry person. I don't think you did either. But when you see people making decisions about your wife that you have not approved, when you see if you will, the deterioration of your wife's mind, you found yourself being angry at individuals and even angry at God. Can you share some of that?
Yes. The first chapter is called Rage in a Psych Ward. And when Becky was first put in a psychiatric unit, I was exposed to a world that I knew nothing about. A friend of mine and I went to visit her, and we went through a metal detector. We had to leave things behind, couldn't take in a cell phone. And when I walked in, I found Becky wandering around with the most pitiful expression on her face. So I went over to her, hugged her, and wanted to go into her room with my friend and talk to her. And someone basically yelled at me and said, you can't go in there with her. And I said, what? This is my wife. No, you can't. It's against the rules. So then we went outside the room, and I got some chairs together, and we sat down, and there was a fellow speaking on the phone very, very loudly. I said, could you please not speak so loudly? And he started yelling at me, and I started yelling at him. It was not a pretty sight at all, and I was very angry at everybody. Now, thank God the next day I went back, had breakfast with Becky, and I apologized to everybody in sight that I could. But I am an intense person. I think I'm a little bit like Jeremiah, fire in my bones, and it has to come out. So I have been extremely angry with God, but I'm not alone. We have the Psalms of Lament. Psalm 39 and Psalm 88 don't resolve. The end of Psalm 39, David basically says, God, leave me alone so I can have a better life. That's how it ends. Mm-hmm. And then Psalm 88 is the Psalm of Heman the Ezrahite. And the last line of that is, darkness is my closest friend. So I found great comfort and help along the way, realizing that the Bible gives us the full expression of emotion before God. I don't recommend being angry and yelling at God, by no means. But for me, it's been part of this experience. It happens less often now. But I was faced with a whole complex of conditions I had never experienced before, and all of them were difficult, and all of them were searingly painful.
Wow. Chapter 6, of course, is the temptation to hate God. Chapter 7, learning to lament. And Chapter 8, joy in lament. And it takes you through some of those. Of course, you have done your doctoral dissertation on Blaise Pascal and Ponce's. Was there anything out of that that would be helpful? We've been quoting, of course, from the scriptures, but there are godly men and women throughout the ages that have given us some perspective on pain and lament and anger and just the whole issue of evil in the world.
Mm-hmm.
What about that?
Well, I don't reflect on Pascal a whole lot, but I do mention a prayer that he wrote called Prayer to Ask of God the Proper Use of Suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And he was someone who took suffering seriously. In fact, he may have been a little too morbid about it. But in American culture, we typically don't develop any kind of philosophy, theology, practice of suffering. We want to put it behind us and move on. And we often don't know how to comfort people who are suffering. We sometimes try to cheer them up, when in fact what they need is for us to suffer well with them, right, and to sit with them and to pray for them. So that's what I'm really trying to do in the book. I'm trying to help people take their struggles, take their suffering before God, and then realize they're not alone. God is with them. Other people are there. We have so many resources in the scriptures. I have found tremendous encouragement in the book of Ecclesiastes,
yes,
which I've been reading and meditating on now for 40 years. So I have a number of quotations and references to that book.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll give some of you a chance to join the conversation if you'd like. Perhaps this is connecting with your own journey or a struggle that you have been having as well. And we'll talk a little bit more with Doug Groothuis. Of course, he also is a teacher, so he has a section here on lamenting in the classroom, lamenting online, and some other issues that I think would be helpful to you as well. But if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to listen to this again, of course, you can download the podcast by going to the listen button on pointofview.net, or of course you can watch this as well as it is posted on the YouTube channel. So all of it available at our website, pointofview.net. So take the time to find some of those resources. And if you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. The book, once again, is entitled Walking Through Twilight, A Wife's Illness, A Philosopher's Lament. About 180 pages. Douglas Groothuis is the author, a foreword by Nicholas Wolterstorff, and, of course, incredible endorsements by many of the individuals that have been on this program, like Oz Guinness and Eric Metaxas and J.P. Moreland and Lee Strobel. It is published by University Press. Look for it in your local bookstore. We'll be back right after this.
Black Friday, Cyber Monday, there's no end to the ways people are enticing you to spend money. But in the spirit of giving, a reminder that tomorrow is Giving Tuesday. The idea is that amidst the rush to consume, we'll also remember to invest in things that matter. And for Point of View, in line with 2-for-1 specials and BOGO, buy one, get one, we invite you to step up and duet. D-O-E-T. What is that? Donate 1 equals 2. You donate $1 to Point of View Radio, and through a special deal with one of our friends, your dollar becomes 2, your $20 becomes 40, your 50 becomes 100, your 1,000 becomes 2,000. So just duet. Donate 1, which equals 2. And our doors are open now. Click the banner at pointofview.net. Or call 1-800-347-5151. Or mail your donation before the clock strikes 12 Tuesday night. Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Pointofview.net. Just do it. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Dr. Doug Groothuis with us today. And in just a minute, we'll get into some of his chapters on lamenting in the classroom. As I failed to mention earlier, of course, is a professor at Denver Seminary. And again, they at one point even provided a paid leave for him, and we'll talk about that. But let me take a phone call that relates to some of the conversation we've already had on the subject of anger. Andrea in North Carolina, you're on with Doug Groothuis. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Kerby. Anger, I think, it's a problem for me because I don't feel good about expressing it or even having it. But what he was sharing, and when my mother was getting sicker, she had expressive aphasia where she had emphysema and she couldn't, the medications would affect, she was always a quiet woman anyway, you know. But I was angry, and my sister and I had a very intense discussion about, you know, Mom, and then hung up on one another because there were so many issues in our family about her being quiet. But the deal is, I feel like for me, being a Christian, it's a lot of guilt, a deep guilt with me feeling angry and feeling like I shouldn't feel it. And God, you know, the scriptures encourage, I'd like him to speak to that about guilt, you know, and feeling angry as a Christian, because I know God can deal with it. I don't think people can, but I think God can deal with it.
Yes, be angry and sin not. What would you say about that, Doug?
Well, that was exactly the scripture I thought of, Kerby. Certainly we know that fits of rage are not from the Lord. That's of the flesh, and I talk about that. That's in Galatians 5.
Right.
And sadly, I have had some fits of rage, and I certainly don't commend it. But it's a fallen, broken world, and often we are not only troubled, we are incensed at the evils in the world. And God is the Lord over all creation, and he's in charge. So I'm encouraged that what you find in the Psalms and also in Ecclesiastes and so on and Job is real lament and real often consternation before the Lord. I think it's better to be angry at God than to ignore God. And the best place to be angry at God is on your knees, if not literally, then figuratively. And often we do get too angry, and then we come back to our Lord. We come back to the cross and ask for forgiveness, knowing that it's there for us through the work of Christ.
Sure. And weren't there times when Jesus was angry? I mean, some people say, well, you're quoting the Old Testament, Job and Lamentations, Jeremiah, Ecclesiastes, but, you know, you have that in the New Testament too. And you see the Apostle Paul, at one point, he's troubled in his spirits, but, when he's at Mars Hill, he seems to me like he's angry. You know, he's frustrated. He's ready to speak out. So anger is a legitimate emotion, which in this 21st century kind of political correct Christianity says, no, you can't get angry. You're supposed to just be nice and gracious to everybody. And I certainly think we should be at peace with all men wherever possible. But at the same time, I think that issue of anger. I have a lot of other questions that people want to ask, but I want to get to this issue of lamenting in the classroom for just a minute, because anybody knows you knows not only that you speak and write and teach and preach, but that you are a professor. And I, first of all, want to commend Denver for recognizing that Denver Seminary at one point said, you know what, it's maybe time for you to have paid leave. And you said at first there was relief, then there was guilt. But then you had one of your students that even said, you know, Dr. Groothuis, you don't need to apologize.
Right. Yes, that was about 1.5 years ago. And as I often say, I was hanging by a thread, but the thread was knit by God. Or another way of looking at it is I was getting pretty close to the edge, and I wasn't sure what was over the edge, but whatever it was not good. And some of my students, and I think a few of my colleagues, talked to our dean, and he called me into the office and said, we're putting you on paid leave. We know you're struggling. And we've arranged for your classes to be taught by other people. You don't have to worry about that. And I was very grateful. I had been praying, asking God to lighten my load. There's a prayer of the Chinese underground church, Lord, don't lighten my load, strengthen my back. And I prayed, Lord, strengthen my back and lighten my load, please. But there is a place to be open in the classroom. I noticed the last several years my students will say, we want to get to know you, not just the subject matter, not just what you know, but you.
Right.
So I do bring in my story of lament into the classroom. I hope not too much so, but especially when I'm lecturing on the problem of evil. How can there be an all-good, all-powerful God when there's so much evil? I'll say there are philosophical answers to that, and I think they're sufficient. But then there's also the problem of suffering. Just how do we get through life, this broken, groaning world in search of its redemption, day by day, following Christ? And that's where the theology of lament and the practice of lament has been pivotal. In fact, I've been developing a talk, and I'll probably put this in the second edition of my apologetics book, called Lament as a Christian Apologetic.
Very good.
You see that in Tim Keller's book, Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering.
Right.
Not only does God give us the resources to suffer well, but this is a testimony to the world.
Let's take another phone call real quickly. We'll go to Audrey in Georgia, WLPG. Audrey, thank you for calling today. You're on with Doug Groothuis.
Hello, and thanks for taking my call. And that is WLPT as in Thomas that I listen to and have been for many years.
Oh, very good.
I'm 77, and my daughters have been told by my sister and friends of mine that they were concerned about me because of my forgetfulness and sometimes not being able to navigate around the town I've lived in for 37 years without my GPS or just being forgetful in those areas. And they took me to a neurologist, and I had a brain scan. The doctor didn't have a positive diagnosis, but he didn't say that I didn't have anything to be concerned about. He said my brain is aging and these things do come along. And he gave me a prescription for some medicine that he said might help me to be able to help my memory, actually. And my family's talked with one another about my prognosis and what they might expect. And I got wind of that. If I'm getting dementia, what plans I should be making while I'm still able to think and plan, and how long do I have an idea how long it might be before I might starting, exhibiting these more symptoms and so on.
Yes. And I'm not sure, of course, you're not a doctor, but you've been through a little bit of that journey. Any helpful suggestions or thoughts?
Well, it sounds like you're being wise already, and you're being supported by your family, and you're walking with the Lord, trusting God through the fears and the challenges. I think if you continue to do that and receive skilled medical advice, then the Lord will make a way for you. Sometimes people simply don't admit that some issues are coming about, and that can be troublesome, and that can even be dangerous if you're talking about driving. One of the first symptoms I saw with Becky is that she got lost coming back from her hairdresser. But the brain does age. I'm 60, and I notice it. I don't have dementia, but our brains do slow down a little bit, and it doesn't mean that you're getting dementia per se. But I'll certainly pray for you, and it really sounds like you're doing the right things right now.
Audrey, I appreciate your calling, and let me encourage all of our listeners to pray for you. So I appreciate you being vulnerable and sharing that with us today.
Well, thank you so much for taking my call and for what you have to offer in advice. Thank you.
You know, one of the things that is in your book is you do talk a little bit about, plans that you could make. I mean, in some respects, you talk about, analyze the task and plan to address the task, those kinds of things. And there's some decision making that you need to make and those kinds of things. So the book is just full of even some practical suggestions. And I need to take another one of those mandatory breaks. But when I come back, I'd like to talk about some things that we should be careful of. And one of those, of course, is, after a while you get tired of answering the question, how's Becky doing? But another one that I thought was really powerful is when people will come in and they'll talk about her as if she's not there, or as if she's like your dog Sunny. And I thought that was a really powerful piece there as well. Sometimes we try to do the right thing, but we don't know what to say, and we almost always say the wrong thing, and we don't necessarily make it easier. So maybe just a few lessons that we can learn vicariously from you as we walk in your shoes with you. So let's take a break. And again, let me just mention that if you are interested in this book, I would imagine you'll be able to find it in your local bookstore. But if not, we have a link so that you can order it. And again, it is available both in paperback and in Kindle. It is published by InterVarsity Press, about 170 pages. Walking Through Twilight. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Most residents of Lehigh County, Pennsylvania probably have no idea what their county seal looks like. It has a cow, factories, a silo, an oil lamp set on 2 books, a courthouse, flags and bunting, and more. Recently, a federal district court reluctantly declared the seal unconstitutional because, centered in the background of it all, is a cross. According to the court's opinion, quote, the county has not legally compelled its citizens to practice and conform to Christianity, infringed on freedom of conscience, or created political conflict between the Christian church and other religious sects. Simply put, the county of Lehigh did not intend to establish religion or institute a county religion, unquote. And so the court concluded, quote, Lehigh County's seal is a passive symbol that does not coerce any citizen to practice or adhere to Christianity and does not establish a county religion. Thus, the seal does not violate the plain text of the Establishment Clause, nor does it establish a religion in the way the drafters of the First Amendment imagined. Higher courts, however, have delineated a different mechanism by which the court must determine whether the seal survives constitutional scrutiny. While the court may not fully agree with the test provided, the court must apply that test, unquote. Well, we can only hope an appeal will change that test. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Students and teachers are being told that prayer, Bibles, and religion are illegal in public school, but that's not true. Learn the facts. Read your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit for students and teachers at firstliberty.org right now. Don't let anyone steal your freedom with bad information. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit for students and teachers at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Dr. Douglas Groothuis with us today as we talk about his book, Walking Through Twilight, A Wife's Illness, A Philosopher's Lament. If you'd like to join us, might get in 1 or 2 more phone calls, 1-800-351-1212. But first of all, let's talk about maybe some things that we can learn as we are around individuals that are maybe starting to have things fall apart. And one of those is, the question, of course, how is Becky? But you also had somebody who was really trying to be helpful and said, well, I had a friend that had Alzheimer's and he was happy to the end, so it might not be all that bad. But you had to kind of clarify, well, it's not going to be that way. And so sometimes people in trying to make merry a sad heart, if I can borrow kind of a phrase there, do a great deal of harm. Sometimes it's better to listen and learn before you make one of these statements, isn't it?
I agree. People mean well, but they're unskilled in suffering well with others. So they can often say things that worsen the situation. One of the issues is people think of Alzheimer's when they hear the word dementia. And as I said, Becky does not have that, so the symptomology and the progress of the disease, not a good word, progress, is different.
Sure.
I think one of the biggest things is simply to listen, to not prescribe what would fix things, to listen and to provide concrete help. Bring over a meal or sit with the person who can't be by herself. That is crucial. And treat the person with dignity. I found that when I take Becky out to the doctor sometimes or to the dentist, people will speak to her with these strange terms of inappropriate endearment, like, okay, is that all right, hon? Or Miss Becky. That one always gets me. Nobody ever called her Miss Becky before she was diagnosed with this.
Yeah.
But that's a way that we can have an instructed tongue to speak the word that sustains the weary. That's Isaiah 50, verse 4.
Right.
That's what I pray for myself, and that's something I think we should all pray.
Yeah, that was one of them. I was going to get to the Miss Becky or some of the other kind, or even speaking like you're speaking to a child, where the other is to ignore them. And I know I would, if I was not careful, I would fall into that. If I was with you and Becky, I would tend to talk to you and say, well, how's she doing? Instead of looking at her saying, how are you doing? Because I know, first of all, she's not going to give me an answer. But I don't want to treat her like she's Sonny the dog. But there's the awkwardness of wanting to have a conversation, but knowing that you really can't have it with her, but not wanting to treat her as if she's not there in person. So you see what I'm getting at, I'm sure.
Exactly. It's difficult to know what to do, but I think of one of our deacons at my church, Katie Gale, and she sometimes brings over communion to Becky, and she always looks right at her and speaks to her and serves us the sacrament. And she's a great model of treating someone with love and respect, at the same time knowing what Becky's sad limits are right now.
So again, what would you suggest as people get this book? Because it is sort of an autobiography and it's sort of a memoir, but it seems to me that there are listeners right now that are saying, oh, should I just grab this copy of this book and give it to a friend who I know is walking through their own twilight, or is this a possible book that I could have as a Bible study? Should I read it with them together? Have you thought about how God could use this book in an effective way?
I have, and probably a year or two before I started writing the book, I met with an expert on dealing with these kind of issues, with the legal, financial, psychological problems. And I told her about myself. I said I was a philosopher, and my wife had this condition. She said, you should think about writing a book for caregivers who are a little more intellectual, a little more thoughtful. She said, don't write a how-to book, but write a book that will stimulate good thinking about the subject. I'm a philosopher, so the book is very philosophical. I think the most philosophical chapter is called It is Eerie, where I consider what the decline of a person mentally looks like and how it can be surprising and a little bit eerie in some ways. It's not written at a high academic level, but you may need to get out the dictionary a few times and read slowly. One of my friends, you probably know him, Marshall Shelley. He's now at the seminary.
Sure.
Marshall read it, and he said it's both a memoir and an education. So there are references, many, to Scripture, to philosophers, to jazz, to all kinds of things. I think it's an interesting read as well as a guide on how to lament.
Well, again, I think it would be very helpful for all of us to read, just so that we will be more sensitive to the circumstances that we will find ourselves in. For those of you that are pastors, I can't even imagine you wouldn't want to at least have one or two copies of this to hand out. as you're counseling, first of all, for you to read, but second of all, to hand out those that you might be counseling. And so, again, I just have always been a fan of Doug Groothuis since we actually worked together at Pro Ministries, and we have had him on almost on every single one of his books, and look forward to the next opportunity. So, Doug, thank you for being so honest in the book. Thank you for having such an incredible impact over, I guess it's been now 30 years, which we've interviewed you on various books and helped us really to think deeply about these issues and know how to learn how to defend our Christian faith. So it's been great to have you on the program today.
Yeah. Well, Kerby, thank you for being such an excellent interviewer. I've done interviews now for over 30 years, and you are in the top two with Janet Mefford. I think you guys are tied.
Well, I'll take that pretty good. We like Janet, too. Well, again, say hello to Becky again. If she, as you said, remembers me, I will maybe get to some other phone calls another day, but we are simply out of time. So, Doug, thanks for joining us today here on Point of View.
You're welcome.
Let me just mention before we're done that some of you might say, I'd like to maybe listen to this again, or I'd like to pass this on to some individuals that need to hear this. You can go to our website, pointofview.net, click on the button that says watch, and you can watch it again or listen and download the podcast and send it to others. This book is something that I think will be very helpful to you, about 170 pages. And it is published by InterVarsity Press, and it's available both in paperback and in Kindle. Let me just say that as we are coming to the end of our day before Giving Tuesday, we certainly want to encourage you to take the time to visit our website and click on the button that says Giving Tuesday, or if you already receive emails from me, we have sent that out and encouraging you to think about giving before December comes, and that is tomorrow is Giving Tuesday, and so we encourage you to click on that button and then recognize that your gift will be doubled. So again, perhaps you would say, I'd like to send you $100 and turn it into $200, or $50 becomes $100, $250 becomes $500. We even have a button there for $500. I know some of you would like to give it that amount, and that becomes $1,000. We are thrilled to have an individual or two that has actually stepped forward and provided the funds so that we can double your gift during Giving Tuesday. We'll have more to say about that tomorrow, but I wanted to give you an opportunity before Tuesday to give and to have your amount doubled. And as we get into the December year, I recognize that especially since Christmas is on Monday, we'll only have a few days after Christmas to even talk about year-end giving. So consider what you might do right now. That's what I'm going to do. And since some of these ministries also have a match fund, I'm going to be giving to those ministries. So I hope you will do the same, and hope you'll consider Point of View in your giving as well. Well, that's all we have for today. If you would like to know more about the mystery of the Magi in our first hour, or walking through the twilight in the second hour, all of it available at the website pointofview.net. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. Looking forward to a great week of broadcast. We'll see you back here tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Black Friday, Cyber Monday, there's no end to the ways people are enticing you to spend money. But in the spirit of